The number of full-time and full-time equivalent employees that you have in your organization is one of the main factors that determines which, if any, of the Affordable Care Act tax forms you will be required to submit to the IRS at year end. In this lesson, you will learn about the tools that are available in the payroll application in Stage 300 Construction and Real Estate to track the number of full-time and full-time equivalent employees that worked for your company for each month of the year. After completing this lesson, you will be able to assign the appropriate ACA exempt status for full-time and not exempt employees. You will be able to indicate which pay IDs should be included in the hourly calculations for Affordable Care Act reporting. And you will be able to enter the hours worked in each month for the not exempt employees and determine your full-time and full-time equivalent employee counts.
Before you can determine your full-time and full-time equivalent employee counts, you will need to assign the appropriate ACA exempt status to each of your employees. In the Employee Setup window, on the ACA Coverage tab, you are able to assign the ACA exempt status for each employee. For the purposes of this lesson, we will only be considering employees who are not exempt from Affordable Care Act reporting. For any employees who should be considered full-time and are not exempt from ACA reporting, select the ACA exempt status of full-time. The IRS defines any employee who is employed for 30 hours or more per week on average as full-time. Employees who are marked as full-time are automatically included in the full-time employee count tracked in payroll. For any employees who are not full-time and are also not exempt from ACA reporting, select the ACA exempt status of not exempt. The hours entered for employees who are not exempt are used to calculate the full-time equivalent count for ACA reporting considerations. If you have employees whose hours fluctuate on a monthly basis, you can adjust the monthly ACA exempt status using the Employee Dependents Detail button. The employee will be included in full-time employee counts for the months they have an ACA exempt status of full-time, and the hours they work in months where they have an ACA exempt status of not exempt will be used in full-time equivalent employee count calculations. There are reports available in payroll that you can use to determine and eventually enter the hours worked for each not exempt employee. In order for these reports to provide accurate information, you must indicate which pay IDs you would like the system to use to track hours worked for ACA reporting. To do this, go to Setup, Pays, and use the List button to find and select a pay ID that should be included in Affordable Care Act hourly calculation totals. For example, select the pay ID you use to enter regular hours worked for your employees. Now click OK, and select the Include in ACA Hours checkbox. The reports that we will be looking at in just a moment are designed to show only the hours entered for pay IDs that have the Include in ACA Hours checkbox selected, so it is important that you go through your pay IDs and mark this box as appropriate. Now click Save, and you can follow these same steps on each pay ID that should be included in Affordable Care Act hourly calculation totals. After all of the appropriate pay IDs have been updated, click Close. Now that you have your employees set up with the appropriate ACA exempt statuses, and you have assigned which pay IDs you would like the system to use to track hours worked for ACA reporting, you are ready to start the process of calculating your full-time and full-time equivalent employee counts. These calculations can be made for you using the ACA compliance task in the payroll application. To access it, in Payroll, go to Tasks and select ACA Compliance. Each time this window opens, it will default to the current year, but you can change it by selecting another year in the list if you need to. In the table, each active employee is displayed, with columns for each month in the year that you can use to record the hours that were worked. By default, terminated employees are not displayed. If you want to see terminated employees in this table, select this checkbox. For the purposes of this window, an employee is considered terminated if the termination date entered on the Employee Setup Miscellaneous Info tab is more recent than the dates entered for the hire date or rehire date, and is not in the year selected here. Earlier in this lesson, you learned how to record the Affordable Care Act exemption status for each month of the year for each employee under Setup, Employees, ACA Coverage. For each month that an employee was designated as full-time, the units column will be pre-filled with 130, and the fields will be unavailable for editing. For each month that an employee was designated as not exempt, the units field is available for editing. In order for the totals at the bottom of this window and values on reports to be accurate, you must manually enter the number of hours these employees worked in each month. To enter the hours worked, click into a cell and enter the number of hours the employee worked in that month. Then just work your way down the list of employees, entering the hours each non-full-time employee worked in the month.
However, if your company enters daily time using the hourly distribution window, you can automatically pull the hours into the units field in the ACA compliance window. To do this, click the Use Daily Distributions button in the ACA compliance window. A warning message will appear. Clicking Yes to this message will override time entries that were manually entered in the ACA compliance window for non-exempt part-time employees and populate with hours calculated from the daily distribution record. Click Yes to this message to continue. The table now shows the hours worked per month for part-time employees. Since employee 104 worked more than 130 hours in the month of May, the software will change May to be full-time and gray out the units field. In the Affordable Care Act Compliance Details window, the ACA exempt status for May has changed to full-time since the employee worked over 130 hours in the month of May. As units are entered by month for each employee, the totals at the bottom are updated. Monthly totals include all hours entered in the month column for each employee. For full-time employees, the software uses 130 hours. For non-full-time employees, it will use the number of hours entered here.
The FTE count provides the total number of employees that are considered full-time for Affordable Care Act reporting. Any employees who have a full-time Affordable Care Act exemption status on the employee setup are included in this total, as well as any employees whose hours that you have entered above total 130 hours or more in the month. This value will be used in column B in Part 3 of the 1094-C form when you print it at the end of the year. The FTE count displays the total number of full-time equivalent employees who worked in each month. This includes the FTE count below, as well as the total number of units up to 120 hours entered in the table above for non-full-time employees, divided by 120. For example, if you had two employees that each worked 60 hours, this would equal one full-time equivalent employee. This total should only be used for Affordable Care Act reporting purposes, and should not be used for any other purposes, such as determining if you are eligible for tax credits, as this may use a different method for calculating full-time equivalency. If you need more information about these values and how they calculate, including examples, read the help topics for this window, which you can access by clicking the question mark icon here. If you need to make changes to any of the Affordable Care Act information for a given employee, you can click the ellipse button at the end of the row to open the Affordable Care Act Compliance Details window, the same one you accessed earlier from the employee setup, to make changes. For example, if this employee was incorrectly marked as full-time and should instead be considered not exempt, make the change here and update any of the other information in this window as needed. Keep in mind that depending on your situation, it may also be appropriate for you to update the offer of coverage, employee share of premium, and safe harbor information for the remaining months in the year, depending on how the information must be reported on the 1095-C form. See the instructions for Forms 1094-C and 1095-C on the IRS website for details about how this information should be reported on these forms. Once you have made the necessary changes, click Save and close the window by clicking the X in the top right corner. Back in the Affordable Care Act compliance window, notice that the units fields are now available on the row for this employee, and you can now use them to record the hours worked. You can update the information in this table as often as you like, whether it be at the end of each month or just once at the end of the year, to get the total number of full-time and full-time equivalent employees for Affordable Care Act reporting purposes. You can save your progress and return to this window at any time. Just make sure to click Save, and then you can close the Affordable Care Act compliance window. Now, you may be wondering, how will I know the number of hours to enter in the table? There are two reports available that you can use to determine the number of hours to enter for each of the not exempt employees for each month in the Affordable Care Act compliance window. The first report we will look at provides the hours worked for each month based on the dates used on the time entries for each employee. To access it, go to Reports and select ACA Reporting. Let's select ACA Daily Time Entry by month. Now, select the payroll transaction file that contains the checks you want to include in the report. We will choose the current file. This report prints a detailed listing of daily time distributions that have been entered into payroll and is designed to be used to determine the number of hours worked by each of your not exempt employees for each month. It was created to help you determine the number of hours to enter in the ACA compliance window that we just looked at. Now, there is one consideration for using this report that you will need to be aware of. This report requires that your time entries in payroll are entered with the date for the corresponding hours worked. You may be wondering what that means. It is not a requirement in payroll for time entries to be recorded by date, so whether your time entries include the date or not depends on your workflow and how you enter the hours for each of your employees. Time entries in your system will have a date on them if the time entry view that you use when entering time contains the date column, like you see in this example. When using a time entry view that includes the date column, the date worked will be entered on each row of time and stored with the time entries, and the ACA Daily Time Entry by Month report will provide you with the hours worked by month totals. If not, don't worry. There is another report you can use to get this information by period end date that we will look at in just a moment. Now, assuming your time entries are recorded with dates on them, you can use the date range prompts here to control the information displayed on this report. The dates you enter here will be compared to the dates recorded with each time entry, allowing it to provide you with the total hours worked for each employee in each month. For example, enter the first day of the month for which you want to get the total hours worked for in the first prompt field, and the last day of the month in the second prompt field. There are two other options here that will affect the results of this report. Earlier in this lesson, you learned about the field on the PayID setup window that you can use to indicate if a pay should be included in ACA hourly reporting. If you do not select this checkbox, the report will display time entries for all PayIDs. But if you want to limit the report to include only the PayIDs that have been marked to be included in ACA hour totals, leave it selected. The second prompt field, Only Show Non-Exempt Employees, will restrict the report to showing only the time entries and totals for employees that have an ACA exempt status of not exempt. If you want to include full-time employees on this report, you can remove the check mark here. Otherwise, you can leave it selected and only the not exempt employees will be included. Let's preview the report. And here you see all of the time entries for pays that were selected to be included in ACA hours totals for any employees with a status of not exempt for the date range specified. You can use this report at the end of each month to determine the number of work hours to enter into the ACA compliance task that you saw earlier. Remember, though, that this report is only able to provide this information if your time entries are recorded with the corresponding dates. If your time entries do not include a date on them, there is another report called the timesheet that you can use to get this information. To access it, go to Reports, Pay Period Processing, and Timesheet. Now, select the payroll transaction file that contains the checks you want to include in the report. We will choose the current file. Start by entering the range of period end dates to include on the report. Just below the date range fields, notice the prompt field Only Show ACA Pays. Just like the other report, this is used to limit the information that is displayed. If you do not select this checkbox, the report will display time entries for all pay IDs. But if you want to limit the report to include only the pay IDs that have been marked to be included in ACA hourly calculations, leave it selected. Now let's preview the report. And here we see all of the time entries for pay IDs that have been marked to be included in ACA hourly calculations for the period end dates specified. You can use this report to determine the number of work hours recorded each month to enter into the ACA compliance task that you saw earlier. ACA Reporting, and select the ACA Hours Allocated report. This report will display the information entered in the Affordable Care Act compliance task for the year specified here, and you can compare it to either of the reports you saw previously to confirm that the hours were entered accurately for each month. This report is designed to print only the hours you have entered in the Affordable Care Act compliance window for employees with a status of not exempt. The hours will be blank on this report for any employees that have a status of full-time, so you can leave this checkbox selected to exclude them. You can see that the hours that were entered in the Affordable Care Act compliance task are displayed, along with total hours worked for each month and the year across the bottom. Use this report to confirm that the hours for each non-full-time employee have been entered accurately. If you find a mistake, you can go back to the Affordable Care Act compliance task to make corrections. Now that you have completed this lesson, you should be able to assign the appropriate ACA exempt status for full-time and not exempt employees, indicate which pay IDs should be included in hourly calculations for Affordable Care Act reporting, and enter the hours worked in each month for the not exempt employees and determine your full-time and full-time equivalent employee counts.